The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, who is also the chair of the task force on artificial intelligence, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to add to Representative Perlmutter's list of your triumphs the record level of small business formation. And so I think that when you try to preserve the very strong economic recovery, I realize you have a dual mandate, but keep an eye on that one too. It's one of the most important successes we don't talk about enough. Do you remember the misery index?
I do.
Yeah, and so that when unemployment drops from 14% to 4%, so drop by about 10%, and then the inflation goes from 2% to 7%, so up by 5%. Does that mean the misery index is increased or decreased?
It would be decreased.
So thank you for that. Now you actually mentioned repeatedly that the inflation problem was largely one of goods. And not so much one of demand or and also of labor shortage. And so can you make any rough estimate of what fraction of the inflation we're seeing was due to sort of those three effects?
So I should be clear. Inflation is also too high in the service sector. I wouldn't want to oversell that. But the real big change has been in goods, which had negative inflation or close to zero inflation for 25 years. I don't have off the top of my head the ability to just tell you what the contribution of that is, but it's big, and it's a significant part of it. It's a lot of it also is energy, which is not
obviously a worldwide problem.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that this is, if you could get back something a little more quantitative from your staff on that, I'd just be really interested in knowing your estimate. Now, in terms of the labor shortage, back in the days when we had a different Senate, they passed comprehensive immigration reform that was then, of course, blocked by Republicans. And many studies at the time indicated it would be a huge positive for our economy to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And that was at a time which didn't have an extraordinarily tight labor market. Is there anything you can think of that would invalidate those studies that showed that comprehensive immigration reform in both the low skill and the high skill sectors would be a huge plus if it was passed?
If I can answer that this way, if you look back at the trend, let's say 5 years ago in that range of immigration, legal immigration, people coming in, and look where we are now. We're now several million people, many of whom would be in the workforce short of that. So lower immigration is definitely part of the story of the labor shortage. But that's what I would say.
And so is there anything quantitative you can say about the time scale for unwinding the balance sheet? Do you think of this in terms of a fixed time scale that we want to go back to normal in the next 2 years, 3 years, or do you say we're going to take it down by 1%? 1% a month, or are you anticipate some sort of feedback loop? Well, we look at the taper tantrums or the equivalent and sort of adjust it as you go.
So the way we did it last time is we set a cap on the amount that will run off, and anything above that gets reinvested for both MBS, mortgage-backed securities, and for treasuries. We haven't had that discussion at the committee. We will have it in 2 weeks. But I guess it takes. It turns out that the level of the cap doesn't really matter that much for how long it takes. Something in the range of 3 years to get back to where you're trying to get to. And the way we define that, what is the end? The end, we look at the size of the economy, the size of the banking system, and we ask, what's the level of reserves that we'll need at that point? And so we set a course for that place, and then as we start to get close to it, we might slow down a little bit, like as though it were an airplane, and that's the way it will work. But I think something in the range of 3 years to get back to what the balance sheet needs to be, which is basically reflective of the public's demand for our liabilities plus a buffer, and what we call ample reserves.
Yeah. Do you have an estimate for how many hours of your life have been spent attempting to explain the difference between quantitative easing and monetizing the debt to members of Congress?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. Now, one of the most valuable functions of the Fed is to provide the emergency assistance to the financial systems of the free world. And you mentioned that you stood ready. Are there specific things you're worried about in Eastern Europe where the economies are very more tightly tied to Russia? where you may really have to step in and get involved? Any specific worries?
You know, what we're watching is sort of the global markets and the dollar funding market, and we're seeing markets that are functioning, and of course we have tools and we have things in place to deal with stresses should they emerge. That's really what we're doing, and as I mentioned, markets are functioning, so we haven't had to deploy any of those tools.
Thank you, and my time's up. I yield back.